welcome to our webinar for the Southeastern District. We are going to go through the seminar now. We have two speakers, two very high-profile speakers for you this evening. The first speaker is Deridre Sinnott McFeat. She's a Senior Policy Inspector with the Health and Safety Authority. Deridre is going to take us through the legal requirements for fleet risk management and go through a programme from a regulatory perspective. Deridre is the Chair of the IOSH Southeastern District of IOSH and has 22 years experience as an inspector with the HSA. She currently leads the work-related vehicle safety programme in the HSA, and she's responsible for policy development and national programmes for driving for work, workplace transport and load secure and compliance. She will share unique and current perspective on key requirements for managing transport operations and fleet vehicle risks in your business, and of course signpost some of the best practice and key resources. So apologies again, without further ado, I'll pass you over to Deridre to start the webinar. So over to you, Deridre.
No problem. Thank you, Paul. Welcome everybody, and I have to say I'm delighted that we have up to just now 32 attendees to this seminar, which certainly breaks the records of recent attendances in our events. So thank you all for attending. I'm going to talk about, I suppose, the legal and regulatory requirements around fleet and vehicle risk management in your businesses, and also, I suppose, shine a particular focus on grey fleet risk management towards the end of my presentation, because it appears to be quite a challenge for a number of businesses, and it seems to be the poor relation, certainly in terms of risk management practices in businesses, not just in Ireland but across the board at present, and it does need to be addressed by all businesses that have people that drive their own private vehicles for work. So without further ado, I'll continue. Again, not to let this evening go by without recognizing the fact that we are in unprecedented times, and I suppose in normal times I would be talking about driving for work in a normal context and vehicle risk management in a normal context, but I think we need to also recognize that we are in the midst of a global pandemic. It is putting us under various types of pressure, and there are various responses required of us. But I suppose we also need to bear in mind, and not to underplay in any way, the current crisis that we're all faced with. The risk of deaths associated with COVID-19 globally versus the risk of death associated with driving for work is the risk of being involved in a fatal road collision, whether as a private citizen or whether you're driving for work, at present is greater than the current mortality rate with COVID-19. So although we're currently in the midst of a global public health crisis, when this all settles down and we return to peacetime, I think we also have to realise that over 20,000 people every year lose their lives on the roads, and it's very hard to draw a distinction between work-related driving and driving for private reasons, because the common denominator in all of that is the human being that may be driving for private reasons, commuting, or driving for work at various times of the day, but the driving behaviour doesn't change all that much. Okay, so there's a huge requirement for behaviour, mindsets, and driving and vehicle related practices to change, and for people to, I suppose, up their game in relation to how they work with, on, in and around vehicles to bring down the numbers of deaths, and particularly something that isn't talked about so much, the numbers of serious injuries, which are life-changing, traumatic, not just for the individual, but also for the families and people, the wider community, for everybody concerned. And I think just on that, if you just think about, if you've been involved in even a minor tip or a minor collision in your driving experience to date, did that leave you a little bit shook? Was there a little bit of little bit of reluctance perhaps to drive afterwards. How are you affected psychologically, even if you weren't physically injured? And then think about people that have been involved in collisions of various kinds that you personally know and the impact on them. But we also have to think about the impact on business sustainability and continuity when, unfortunately, these types of events happen on the road and in workplaces involving vehicles. So I'm just talking about that in the current context. And also let's remember that in Ireland, we have established that 23% of road collisions are work-related, based on a recent IOSH funded research project carried out by Professor Anne Drummond. So you know, work relatedness and road collisions is something that needs to be looked at and addressed, and we all have our part to play. So why are we here today? Why are we here this evening? Hopefully the reason you've joined this webinar is to find out a little bit more about this subject. And I certainly would like to share with you what the vehicle harm landscape looks like at present. Why, in my opinion and in the opinion of the Health and Safety Authority, vehicle risks need to be addressed. What vehicle risks in particular needs to be managed in your business based on the data that we have and the evidence base at present. What do you need to focus on? A focus particularly on grey fleet risk, as I mentioned earlier. What good practice looks like in terms of a pragmatic risk control measures that we know work, based on, I suppose, from my 10 years plus of work in this particular area, and based on what I've learned from my European and other global colleagues. If you are tackling vehicle risks and driving for work at your business, where should you go for information? What are the top 10 resources that I would signpost you to? And I suppose just at the very end, I'll just mention very briefly the emerging issues and sort of how you prepare yourself for a COVID-19 response, just generally speaking. Okay, so why manage fleet risk in your business? Why manage driving for work? Well, there is a very clear and emphatic business case for managing road risk at work, in the same way as there's a business case in construction for managing safety on construction sites, in the same way that there's a business case for managing manual handling in the workplace. If you don't manage it, incidents will occur, and I was involved in the production of a report for employers on the business case for managing road risk at work, which clearly, I suppose, gives IOSH professionals and people involved in risk management a script with which they can go to financial controllers and others who hold the purse strings to release funds to help address this risk in the business, and also to identify and quantify the magnitude of the risk to the business. And there are clear business benefits for putting in work-related road risk management practices in particular. And I also want to draw your attention to a relatively new ISO standard, which is specifically a framework for helping businesses manage work-related road risk, and that can be adopted and adapted to any type of business. It provides a framework for action and for risk management. I'm not going to go into the main business benefits because they're outlined there. The details, if you want to look at them, are found in that report. But it is important to note that there has been quite a body of work done now over the last 10 years around the whole area of vehicle risk management, but in particular work-related road risk management. And I will signpost you to the relevant resources accordingly. So what we accept is based on what we know. And why are people not perhaps paying attention to this topic at the moment? And we accept, I think it's fair to say most people accept if I told them that this is a short list of the top high-risk sectors. We accept it because we've known it for a long time. Those sectors have been around for a long time. We look at the world in a particular way and have done, and we accept that, yeah, probably those sectors are in the top 5 or 6 or 7 most dangerous sectors to work in. Okay, and we also accept what we see, and we accept over time all the various signs and risk management supports and nudges, etc., that appear in the workplace to nudge behavior towards safer behavior and to advise people on what to do. So we're used to all those signs in the workplace. We accept them because that's what we know at the moment. But I think what we need to think about is changing the mindsets and focus, and perhaps not just looking at sectors, but looking at particular work activities that people engage in, perhaps within the sectors I previously mentioned, and really maybe think about what are the top 10 dangerous jobs that we could do. And on that list, I haven't put them in any particular order, but driving vehicles is a dangerous job, okay? And I think we need to accept it. And depending on the type of vehicle you drive and the business that you're involved in and the risk exposure profile for the business and for the individual driver, that driving of vehicles can actually be more dangerous than some of the other activities listed there. Okay, and I think people need to shift their mindset towards identifying work activities that are dangerous within the business, rather than just saying, we work in an office supplies company, that's not dangerous. But actually the driving bit for the person who's out doing the sales is dangerous, for example, and can be dangerous depending on a number of factors. And again, just to share with you some of the useful resources that have come from Australia, developed in conjunction with Zurich. The National Road Safety Partnership Programme in Australia has wonderful resources, but in order to maybe help change people's mindsets and focus, they've likened driving for work to working in construction or to working in mining operations, and they have assessed that driving 40,000 kilometers per year in an Australian context has the same risk as mining and a 25% higher risk than construction. Okay, so trying to change people's mindsets and their belief systems around the activity of driving for work. Okay, and we don't have a similar infographic for the Irish context, but you know, it would be great if we could develop a risk rating accordingly, but I don't think it would be very much different to this. So again, just to just look at the world maybe slightly differently than what you do now. Again, when I'm talking to businesses, and I was talking to IBEC members last week, the first question I asked him actually is, well, in your business, what is a business journey? How do you define a business journey for your staff? And are they very, very clear on what constitutes a business journey versus a private journey or a commuting journey? And that's an important thing. And also for yourselves, how do you define a business journey or a journey involving driving for work? Not just driving for work, but traveling for work. This graphic is borrowed from Jacobs Engineering, who've developed again some internal resources for their staff. But not only do we need to consider driving for work, but also business journeys that involve other modes of transport, and they have to be brought into our risk management policies. And once those definitions are developed, the other question then is, what is permitted by the business for business travel? So currently, as we speak, if you're somebody that's involved in IOSH management within the company you work for, or if you're doing consultancy, are you advising on business journeys by, for example, by bike or by e-scooter? Is that a safe practice? Is that built into the business risk management systems or not? Should it be, in fact? And that's, again, down to a risk assessment as well, okay, based on all the current data, knowledge, etc. And just to let you know that in Ireland at present, travelling on or using an e-scooter on the public road or on footpaths is in fact illegal. Okay, so if you've staff who use e-scooters for business purposes or business journeys, they are actually carrying out an illegal activity. So again, you need to upskill yourself in that area of law and compliance as well. All right. Okay, so going to the harm landscape, and I suppose even though this is a bad news picture, in some respects, it is an improvement on the stats that have I've been looking at for the past 10 years, insofar as in 2019, there were 16 vehicle-related deaths that represented 35% of the total number of work-related deaths reported to the authority. And that was a significant reduction from previous years, where the running average was between 42 and 45% of all work-related deaths being vehicle-related. So there are some signs of improvement in one sense, but unfortunately, the numbers of reports that we get do not include, for the most part, work-related road fatalities. Now, this is a very blunt measure of performance, for want of a better word. And what we don't have here is an up-to-date picture, unfortunately, of serious injuries resulting from vehicle-related activities. But things are improving slightly, but 16 deaths reported into our authority in from agriculture, manufacturing, transport and storage, waste management and construction is not acceptable. And those vehicle related deaths, I'm quite sure, could have been prevented had the appropriate measures been in place at driver, vehicle and workplace level. And the majority of those work-related vehicle fatalities have happened in the workplace as opposed to on the road. So we are not getting the level of reporting that we should be getting from employers in relation to fatalities that happen on the road. And the reason I say that is because I do work very closely with the guards, and I'm aware that between 30 to 40 deaths on the road every year at present are more than likely work related in some way. Okay, and we've had 2 reports into the HSA. And I suppose at this juncture, I'd also like to remind you that the accident reporting regulations were revised in 2016, at the end of 2016, and it made it made it very clear that there was a requirement to report work-related road deaths and work-related road collision injuries and dangerous occurrences. So if you're not familiar with that revised piece of legislation, I would urge you to have a look at the General Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act general application regulations and the section on accident reporting, and they're available on the HSA website. Okay, so this is one set of figures that I look at to see how the country is performing, how businesses are performing, and there are other measures as well. So we also look at vehicle related injuries, and to that end we know that a very substantial portion of accidents reported or injuries reported from employers involve vehicles. I also know from the Personal Injury Assessment Board that a large proportion of their employer liability claims involve it's injuries associated with forklift use in the workplace. But the main accident triggers for work-related vehicle injuries, where somebody is injured and out of work for a substantial amount of time, is losing control of a vehicle or piece of mobile equipment, and the cause of injury being collision with an object. again, the sectors most affected are listed there, and there's no surprises. I would say that in public admin, the vehicle profile there is cars and smaller vehicles as opposed to transport, which tends to be larger trucks and manufacturing. And likewise in construction. So I think we need to familiarise ourselves with what's happening in the world of work and the types of injuries and when they occur and who they're happening to, and I suppose the impact on business in terms of absence from work and claims, particularly to the injuries board. So again, we need to maybe think about why vehicle accidents happen. I think at the top of the food chain, we need to think about lack of management control being the primary cause, and then falling out of that, there, lack of systems for work vehicle operations at work, unsafe or unroadworthy vehicles, depending on whether they take to the road or otherwise, lack of awareness of the need and the importance of managing vehicle risks in the business by the employer and the employee, lack of instruction, information, training. Unfortunately, yes, there are people who work with you and for you who will engage in deliberate unsafe acts, and those people need to be tackled. People who engage in killer behaviours, despite the fact that we've had years and years of education around some of those killer behaviours, such as speed, distraction, etc., but they continue to engage in those behaviours even in a work-related context, and unsuitable roads and infrastructure, which employers don't have a direct control over, but they do in a small way sometimes contribute to work-related road collisions. So again, another area where I look for indicators of performance is through the Health and Safety Authority targeted inspection programs. And last year we carried out 398 targeted detailed inspection programs looking at vehicle risk management. And unfortunately, it confirmed what I suspected. And particularly around driving for work, 54% of workplaces inspected had a risk assessment available. Now, we didn't assess in detail the suitability or the comprehensiveness of that risk assessment, but it was just based on, did they actually have a risk assessment available that related to driving for work. Likewise, 58% of businesses had a written risk assessment for load securing. Another area where people are injured and killed is falling from vehicles, and again, only half of employers had risk assessments done. And in terms of vehicle preventative maintenance and repairs and daily checks, 66% of businesses had a risk assessment done, but I think one of the main drivers there might be CVRT compliance rather than IOSH compliance. And it is higher, but it's not really good enough. That around a half of Irish businesses are not, it seems, addressing work-related vehicle risks in a meaningful way in their business. So again, that needs to improve. In terms of what needs to be managed from our perspective, then is really vehicle risk in three areas. So vehicle movements, and I've given you the list there for vehicle movements, vehicle operations, and I've added in there in light of the COVID-19 that hygiene protocols should also be built into vehicle operational protocols at the moment, as you're aware. And on the road then, not just the driving aspect, but also dealing with emergency situations should they occur, such as breakdowns, incidents, deliveries on the road, and also where people have to work on or near the road on a regular basis in live traffic, vehicle parking, and interactions with vulnerable road users. Not an exhaustive list, but just to give you a strong flavour of the areas that you should be focusing on if you're not already doing so. And I suppose employers need to manage vehicle risks and driving for work in the same way as they manage all other workplace risks. And that involves an approach that will yield safe workplaces, safe vehicles, safe drivers, and safe vehicle operations. And I know employers tend to focus more in the workplace, but what I'm urging you to do is to focus more on the road, so that we can start reducing the harm profile that currently exists in Ireland. And in terms of, very simply, you can't manage risk unless you've assessed the level of risk in your business, and the outputs from that are very clear control measures built into procedures, and vice versa. And that's just the fundamentals of occupational risk management, really, but that must apply to vehicles as it does to every other risk in the business. And I suppose just so that we can draw a breath, because it is a bit difficult sometimes to focus when we're doing a long webinar, just ask the question of yourself now: how are you doing? I showed you signs earlier that we're all very familiar with from workplaces, but perhaps some of these signs are not as familiar and should be more widespread in workplaces, to tackle some of those very particular risks associated with the use of vehicles in the workplace. You know, some of those killer behaviours, reminding employees not to engage in dangerous behaviours when using vehicles at work. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to now, I suppose, go into a little bit more detail on grey fleet risks and the basics. And as you can see here, if for those of you who are very astute, I'm actually using the slides that were presented at the recent Driving for Work seminars in conjunction with the Guards and the Road Safety Authority. So it's very important to note here that the message that I'm giving is a joint message from the Health and Safety Authority, on Garda Síochána, and the Road Safety Authority in relation to managing grey fleet. And what we have done over the past 10 years is developed joint messaging to deal with areas of common interest within the legislative framework that we have in Ireland around occupational health and safety, around road safety, and around road traffic, the Road Traffic Act. And we've come up with a common text that covers those three pieces of legislation in one message. Okay, and that's very important to note. So all of the messages that you're going to have in the next 10 or so slides are actually joint common texts from the three agencies around managing grey fleet risks and the basic legal requirements therein. So what I'll cover is why you need to manage grey fleet risk, key considerations there, what you must do legally, how to get started, how to do a grey fleet risk inventory, because unless you do an inventory, a stock check, you know, take stock, you're not necessarily going to manage what you need to manage and prioritise accordingly. I'll just walk you through briefly the grey fleet risk management process. Risk assessment, some tips on how to reduce risk exposure, sample documents, typical controls, I suppose some grey fleet absolutes where I can provide them, and I'll certainly signpost you to key resources to help you tackle both grey fleet risk management, and then after that just some key resources the HSA has developed around vehicle risk management overall. So as I said before, again, let's just take a breath. Let's think about, in your work currently, the people that you meet in the office every day, or the people that you go to meet in the office every day, and how you get there to meet them. And I suppose we're very good at focusing on managing our workplace environment, and particularly, you know, if we're in a non-hazardous sector, where we're relatively safe from the dangers that perhaps others are daily and routinely exposed to in the likes of construction, mining and quarrying, electricity supply, utilities, perhaps road transport. But we have to start looking at the risks that people who drive cars for work are exposed to on a day-to-day basis, and what risks they create, face themselves every day, that are within their control and sometimes not within their control, but also the risks that they create for others that they encounter in their day-to-day work, and when they go out to do business on your behalf. And I suppose just walk through what basic legal requirements need to be met to manage the safety and to discharge the legal duty of care to these people. And when I say these people, I include myself in that. I am a public servant. I drive a grey fleet vehicle. So if what I have produced in terms of policy and guidance to date does not resonate with me and doesn't make sense to me, my family, or even my children, then it's not going to work. Okay, so it has been road tested, for want of a better word, personally, by me, on me, and for me. But there are some practical, pragmatic measures that need to happen in all businesses where people drive grey fleet for work. So again, just to reiterate the why grey fleet and why the focus on grey fleet. It's very common. It's more common in Ireland than it is in the UK and perhaps some other European countries. A quarter of all fatal road collisions, just under a quarter of all fatal road collisions in Ireland are work-related. It's estimated that in Europe it could be up to 40% of road collisions being work-related because they operate in a different way. Cars are involved in about 3/4 of fatal, serious and minor road collisions every single year. So it's a huge number of car involvement, and it's not necessarily obviously people who are driving for work, but just remember the types of drivers that are more likely to be killed are car drivers across the board. Grey fleet drivers drive older cars than company car drivers. They tend to have less safety features, older safety features, less well maintained, and a greater carbon footprint. And they have a higher risk exposure than other car drivers. And I mean other car drivers, people who are just using their car on a not as frequent basis for private use. And it's because of the number of risk factors that are outside of their control, and I'll talk about that in a sec. Grey fleet drivers are more likely to be involved in collisions, therefore, because they have a higher risk exposure. The risk of collision is greater. And we have a moral, a legal and a financial obligation within businesses to manage grey fleet risk effectively from a business sustainability and from a duty of care perspective, if nothing else. And that's again some more reasons which I'm not going to elaborate on. Why has a grey fleet culture developed? It's I suppose historically perceived as a cheaper option. I suppose people who drive grey fleet sometimes are not considered to be doing enough mileage to get a company car, not management grades, and this is just culturally how it has evolved. And maybe some of these reasons will resonate with you and your experience of grey fleet driving. The people who drive in grey fleet are not engaged in a primary business activity. It's for occasional business use. Perhaps somebody crunched the numbers and thought company car not economically viable for everybody. Maybe that was many years ago, and it's continued. But if they were to crunch the numbers today and look at the real risks, I think that formula might be a little bit suspect. Employees are responsible for their vehicle. That's true to a certain extent, but employers are responsible for their employees while they're at work. Less administration for the employer. Okay, so there's some of the reasons, and they're hardcore beliefs and values and business models have been prioritized and developed over time, perhaps around this. But what I'm saying is it's time for a change, and I think we need to see grey fleet and the use of grey fleet in a completely different light. So again, in terms of why managing grey fleet risks, For those of you who commute to and from work in your car every day, that is a less risky journey, relatively speaking, than a driving for work journey where you're driving from home to a business premise or many locations in the course of the working day and perhaps the course of the working week, and back to home at some point, whether the same day or later in the week, depending on the nature of your business. When you commute, you travel from home to work and back again in the same car, usually at the same time, and on the same roads, and things are very familiar for you. When you drive for work, on the other hand, the risk exposure varies depending on many factors, including the driver, the vehicle, the journey, and the business that's being done, and the road type being used. And I'll just talk about that a little bit. And apologies for the technical glitch there in terms of those tables. And here are some of the risk factors involved in terms of the driver: attitude, competence, authorization. And competence is not just that they have a driving license, but it's also about how well they drive and their driving history, etc. Instruction, information, training provided, their fitness to drive. We do have requirements on medical fitness to drive in Ireland, whether you're a Group 1 or a Group 2 driver. And I suppose employers need to be familiar with some of those conditions that may preclude somebody from driving for work. And build those into their systems. Risk profile, age, driving history, experience, and obviously, very importantly, their driving behaviour. In terms of the vehicle, whether the vehicle's owned by the employee or it's provided by the employer, the same factors prevail. And I'll go into some more detail on vehicle. And then journey. And again, these are some of the factors that can reduce or increase the risk rating, for want of a better word, for an individual employee who drives for work. So speed is a killer behavior that people engage in, and again, it's a risk factor. It's a huge risk factor in collisions. Here's an example of messaging that's been developed around speed and speeding to educate and to nudge behavior in the right direction in terms of driving for work. So I'll now go into, I suppose, the basics of managing driving for work. And I suppose, like every other risk in a workplace, a policy needs to be developed and a commitment to manage it. Risk assess, putting safe systems into practice, measuring and monitoring and reviewing safety performance and compliance. Now, this has been outlined, this model. It's the same as the plan, do, check, act model, really. It's elaborating on that. Has been outlined in the Managing Driving for Work, My Responsibilities information sheet that was published a number of years ago. But in terms of managing grey fleet, we have published in October a new piece of guidance specifically to specifically address grey fleet risk management and to help employers better understand and manage grey fleet driving within the business. And I suppose in terms of legal requirements, employers have a legal duty of care to an employee regardless of vehicle ownership. And there should be safety management systems in place for driving for work in your own private vehicle. It should form part of the overall safety management system. So that's a clear statement in terms of what the law requires. Then going into some detail on minimum legal requirements to comply with IOSH, road safety and road traffic laws in terms of grey fleet specifically. This is the list of minimum requirements that we have outlined in that guidance, and I'm not going to elaborate on those bullet points for you, but you can see that first and foremost, the person needs to be legally entitled to drive, but also formally permitted to drive for work in their own vehicle. There needs to be a system of authorization and to manage the employee and the activity the work activity that they're doing. Vehicle that is safe and in a roadworthy condition. It must be motor tax compliant, insured appropriately, that the driver is medically fit to drive, and instructed, trained and informed on company requirements for driving their vehicle safely for work. And of course, complying with rules of the roads at all times. And again, just to draw a breath here and think to yourself, at the moment where I work, are we currently compliant and complying with the minimum legal requirements for employees who drive for work? And I suppose the only way you're going to know that is if you perhaps carry out a risk inventory. And again, I've outlined some of the questions that are included in that information sheet. Do you currently know if an inspector came to call, as it were, would you be able to answer all of these questions in the affirmative or not? And I suppose once you have all this information and sort of take stock, as it were, then you can launch into more detailed gap analysis of where you are, and then into a risk assessment process, both at organizational and individual level, depending on the type of business that you're in. So I suppose now we're moving into a gap analysis. So if we're not sure where we stand on this, what sort of questions should we be asking to establish where the gaps are and what gaps need to be addressed, and make decisions on whether we're currently going to address those gaps, what we're going to prioritize now, what we're going to prioritize maybe for 6 months' time or a year's time. But you need to carry out some form of gap analysis in terms of grey fleet risk management. I've put here a sample of some of the questions. There's 35 questions in total on that information sheet that I mentioned earlier, and these are some of the simple questions that we would ask you to ask yourselves. It's either a yes or a no, and you decide on the action that you're going to take. Now, obviously, we'd encourage everybody to be compliant and meet the minimum legal requirements, but the full list would sort of bring people from a basic level of compliance right up to exemplars of really good practice. So again, I'd ask you to have a look at some of those questions in detail after the webinar, and they're available on the drivingforwork.ie website. So having done your gap analysis, I suppose there are choices that need to be made in terms of reducing risk exposure. And again, some of those choices are outlined in detail in the information sheet that I've mentioned, because I can only really walk you through some of the high level detail in this webinar. But there are choices. The safest journey is the one not taken. So therefore, meetings without moving are absolutely advocated where at all possible. And in fact, in the current public health crisis that we have really discovered that we can be quite agile and flexible and learn how to do meetings without moving and reduce our risk exposure as a byproduct of what's happening. And really, I'd urge you to have a look at, again, the information sheet and look at some of these safer choices that can be made by businesses around grey fleet risk exposure. And see if you can implement some of those in practice. If we talk about then risk assessment specifically, there's really a risk assessment that needs to be done at an organizational level to assess the magnitude of risk associated with I suppose, a work-related road collision or incident involving somebody who drives their own private vehicle for work, impact on business, the type and level of impact, but at an individual level, to also assess the risk to groups of drivers, departments, or drivers within departments and teams, as to the magnitude of business risk and personal and individual risk there as well, just as you would do for any other part of your business, and then make decisions on appropriate control measures. There's generic control measures that everybody should introduce, that we've provided advice on for many years now, but then you need to make decisions on specifically reducing your risk exposure in relation to grey fleet driving. And to help you, we have developed a template with a couple of worked examples, but again, it's not comprehensive. It's purely a template, sample risk assessment template for grey fleet driving, and that too is available on drivingforwork.ie. It's a Word document, so you can amend it, customize it, etc., as you see fit. In terms of the vehicle then, vehicle risk factors, this probably is one of the areas where employers say, well, I can't do anything in this space because these people own their own vehicles and it's not my business. If people are driving for work, their vehicle and the vehicle they use is your business. And you have a duty of care to manage the driving for work activity regardless of vehicle ownership. But as a minimum, employers need to make checks annually on employee vehicle documentation, and in addition, you may carry out random spot checks to verify compliance with the process. And as a minimum, we would be saying that employers need to verify that employees have a vehicle that's roadworthy, motor tax and insurance compliant, and it's safe and roadworthy at all times. Some employers have more robust and I suppose more highly evolved systems in place, and they actually specify for employees the types of vehicles that are permitted to be used for driving for work and the distances people are allowed to travel, and many other requirements, and this is just an example of some. How to manage driver behaviour. I suppose if you're not verifying some of those details in terms of basic compliance requirements, then really you're not really off to a good start in terms of managing grey fleet risk. And I think there are terms and conditions associated with any work activity, normally speaking, and I suppose it's requiring drivers to sign up to those terms and conditions of use and terms of conditions in relation to driving for work. So at the very minimum, there has to be driver license verification to meet the legal requirements for Road Traffic Act and road safety. Verifying the details of the vehicle being driven, and also that the employee ultimately signs up with the line manager, ideally, and renews that perhaps every year, signs up to comply with the terms and conditions for grey fleet driving. That can be either on a paper-based system or it can be done electronically. And for example, where I work, every time we submit an expense claim, we have to electronically sign up to agree to the terms and conditions on every claim submitted. And again, it just reminds us of our obligations for driving for work. If you haven't already got a policy, we have actually put together a sample driving for work policy. Now it's a very basic model which can be customized, adapted, etc. It's a Word document again, but if you haven't already got a policy, or your policy perhaps is not what it should be, I would encourage you to download this sample policy document from the drivingforwork.ie website and customize it for your own purposes. In terms of managing journeys, again, perhaps the old adage of out of sight, out of mind applies to a lot of mobile workers and employees who take to the highways and byways of Ireland every day to carry out business on behalf of either the government or semi-states or private companies. It's really not acceptable anymore to just let people loose without any roadmap, for want of a better word, on where, you know, how they're expected to behave while they're out and about working on your behalf. And employers must make sure that journeys are properly planned by employees, and procedures are in place for emergency situations. So it's all well and good when everything's going well and journeys are going well and business engagements are happening and on time and according to schedule, etc. But what happens in an emergency situation? And unfortunately, in a lot of tragic fatalities on roadsides in particular, they've happened because the people involved have not known what to do in the event of an emergency breakdown or some incident that's happened involving their vehicle. So again, clear instructions required in that regard. And again, some messages, I suppose, that employers should be giving employees around managing those journeys. And some of these messages come from the Driving for Work Driver Handbook. But certainly there should be a conversation. There have to be procedures, but there should be an ongoing conversation, an evolving conversation around journeys, and responsive messages in terms of seasonal factors as well. And again, this is just an example of some messaging that could be adopted and adapted in a workplace for employees to remind them of some of those key messages around journeys. So I suppose just to wrap up on the messaging before I go into signposting resources, I suppose we're accountable not only for what we do, but also what we do not do. And therefore, I would ask you to really reflect and prioritize your grey fleet risk management now. Appoint someone to take ownership and take leadership on this, that it's not spread between a number of disparate people in an organization, that somebody actually has responsibility for managing grey fleet and it doesn't fall between various stools, because often that's what happens, and it's left with one particular function that doesn't actually speak to other functions within the business. Carry out the key steps, put in place a robust, meaningful grey fleet policy, put in place effective grey fleet risk management procedures, and I suppose just take action. Don't wait, because there's a lot of people out there who need to be guided in how to enjoy a safe journey when they drive for work and to get home safely. So if you have more than grey fleet, you can adapt this approach for each vehicle type in your business, obviously. And I suppose we all have a duty to protect ourselves while on the road, but employers have a duty to protect workers on the road and to fulfill their legal duties to make sure that we all get home safe, both the employers and the employees. So just very briefly, just before I finish, I just want to signpost key resources from the HSA, the vehiclesatwork.ie resource portal, and there's a wealth of information there on all aspects of managing vehicle risk at work. The hsalearning.ie online learning portal, and again, there are 4 courses available there on workplace transport risk management and a range of other topics. And a Managing Driving for Work online course, again, available either through hsalearning.ie or drivingforwork.ie. And as I said earlier, I will point you to my top 10 of resources. And that's really it. When I'm looking and when I'm advising people and I'm responding to queries and inquiries, these are my top 10 go-to places to find answers in relation to particularly work-related road risk management. And I suppose I said I'd mention the impacts of coronavirus and COVID-19, and I talked earlier about managing vehicle risks at work. Now we need to think about mapping the public health official advice onto our existing operations to ensure that this particular threat to business safety and sustainability is addressed. And in that regard, I would just say that COVID-19 advice is available for is available for employers and businesses, and I would urge you to refer in the first instance to the public health advice from the HSPC and from the HSE. There is guidance available for businesses and retail, and there's also guidance available for supply chain workers. And the HSA has a dedicated HSA COVID-19 webpage with relevant updates and FAQs, and that's been updated on an ongoing basis. And the HSA are actively supporting the health message by pointing, the public health message, by pointing people in the direction of official advice. And there are some specific pieces of advice available currently on that HSA COVID-19 webpage. So I'm on to the last slide now. Fabian wants to get himself ready, but just in practice, just in relation to this COVID-19 response in terms of your fleet risk management, keep up to date with official advice, download guidance and posters, implement the public health measures in your workplace operations and practices, and keep workers informed of the latest official advice and how it applies to them. Okay, so I'll now hand over to Fabian, who's going to take over the reins and talk about fleet risk management from an insurance perspective. Thank you.
Hello everybody. Right, my name is Fabian Murphy. I'm a risk management surveyor with Aviva. I've got a CPC in transport haulage management operations there a couple of years ago, just to kind of help me to manage fleets and things like that, you know. So the aim of this talk really was to talk about kind of fleet risk management, and what we would do as surveyors when we go out on site and meet management. So what's the benefit to the customer? Basically, we use a fact-find kind of submission documents from an insurance perspective, you know, and we try to read all these documents so that we can help a company with advice and things like that. What's written and what's not written is always taken up, and we can always kind of help the underwriter in establishing how a fleet is well managed. Other sources of public information that Deridre mightn't have mentioned, but we'd also might look at haulage licenses and maybe RSA prosecutions. There's actually shortcuts there on, if you search for them on the RSA and road transport haulage licenses, we can get to see, you know, the size of a fleet and who's in charge and things like that, you know. So the biggest thing, like, you know, when you reduce your losses, so these will be claims and injuries and accidents and collisions and damage and things like that. That equals better stability for yourselves, less volatility in pricing and premiums, and it's better for the wider market. And of course, Deridre mentioned, you know, where do we find the best guidance? Actually, the HSA Driving for Work is a long way to go, or is a good place to go. Things that we look for from a fleet point of view, we see like accident frequency and severity will be a big thing. If you want to reduce your premium, if you want to reduce it, these are critical areas that you need to start to manage. Accident frequency and severity. So maybe a windscreen breakage might not be as dangerous as a rear end collision. So the driver profile is looked at. Claims trends, is it going up, is it going down, what are you doing about it? The vehicle technology and risk management practices. So these will be all part of kind of an Aviva fact finder that we will be looking for. So the financial cost for driving for work. It's all about road-related collisions and things like that, you know, and you've got it's all about reducing your downtime. A good risk is following the money. There's a whole series of you know, Deridre mentioned there was the ETSC, the European Transport, there was a document there about better business, you know, why do you manage a fleet and things like that. And the European Transport Safety Council actually, yes, that produced a fantastic document. But there's a good idea there as to why you should be managing it. And the carbon footprint is a big thing. Fuel costs and efficiency. If you're managing a fleet, you will reduce your fuel costs and you'll improve your efficiency. And that can only be good for the environment as well. I don't know, why is fleet risk management so important? Now, this is a graph. Now, it is great if I was doing this live, I'd have left open an opportunity for people to prompt, what does it look like? Is it a mountain range or what? These are actually the fatal collisions every year since the start of our records. Unfortunately, it peaked over 600 and it drops all the way down. I think you've got a section here where it is kind of plateauing. We hadn't done an awful lot that was doing drink driving. Then it comes in the penalty points. And there was a huge reduction there. But we're not really going anywhere forward here. We're very steady here. We're not progressing much. And last year, the sad part is there was 148 people died. It actually was an increase on 2018. So there was up and down and back up again. So we're not doing anything. So if we do nothing at the moment, we will not improve. If we do nothing, we will remain at this level. And this is not acceptable. Fatal accidents year to date. This is very sobering as well. 47 year to date. That's what I got on the Garda website. 14 pedestrians, 20 drivers, 8 passengers, 4 motorcyclists, 1 pedal cyclist. Total of 47. This time last year, we'd only 38. And we were still, we increased last year on 2018. So it doesn't look like as if we're going to be doing, we're going to do much better. No, that all depends in the big impact on COVID-19 as to how that will reduce we can all see that our getting in and out to the office, if we are driving, there's less traffic on the road, and our social distancing on the road should also help in reducing our collisions. So this is the accident circle. If an employee joins the company, you do a license check, you give him a company vehicle, he'll have a crash, you replace the vehicle, you'll have a crash, replacement vehicle, he'll have another crash. It's not going to go anywhere unless, of course, you start to find a way out. You do a license check, of course. You check his ability to drive, and you do an assessment. Then you allocate a vehicle. If he has a crash, you interview him. You find out why did you have the accident. You do another assessment to see is it his vision, is it something or something like that. You do post-crash accident or action, and you give him a replacement vehicle or a repair and things like that. And hopefully you should not be getting into a cycle. So what is risk management? It's basically to anticipate what can go wrong. The failure is to give us an opportunity to learn and prevent reoccurrence. Proper risk management implies that there is some control over the possible future events, and I want it to be proactive rather than reactive. I'm a big advocate of MBWA, management by walkabout. Go out and have a look at what your drivers are actually doing, how they're parking. I stole this slide actually from Deirdre. Management superpowers. If my manager asked me to be in Dublin tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, miraculously, I will appear in Dublin at 8 o'clock. So management does have a great ability to control driver and employees' behaviour. A big no-no are, these are the killer behaviours that Deirdre had already mentioned. Seatbelt use, speeding. Fatigue is how managers should be able to schedule work that reduce your fatigue, and drinking drugs. Driving distracted, huge one. Mobile phones, they're all big ones. I'm very disappointed personally when I see a lot of haulage HGV drivers, things like that. The number of seatbelt wearers is actually not as good as you would have hoped. The essential, what you should know we thought you should know the essential elements of managing safety. Now, we mentioned these with Deridre. So you've got management, license checking, driver policy handbook, driver safety, driver handbook again, driver vetting and training, vehicle safety, and journey planning. These are the essential elements. And this is what Deridre has been mentioning in the grey fleet and managing driving for work and things like that. License checking, what do we look for? So I'm going to try and break these down just very briefly and things like that. Aviva, so like, yes, there's a road sense guide. We're in the process actually of revising that, you know. So what you should be looking for, you'll be looking at, you know, the person named. Is their license, have they got a license number? Is it still valid today? Suitability for the vehicle. So is it a B license, or are they driving a C truck or something like that? Or have they got a, so that there's all a whole load of things. If you're driving a digger, a fork truck, anything to do with a mini digger or anything like that, or even grass cutting, things like that, you need a W license if you're in a public area. So where's a public area? That could be in a field. That's to be determined, that can be established in a court of law, but everybody really should have a W license as a minimum if you're going to be driving just even diggers. So that might be something that you might want to look at. But if you have any questions, you can come back to me later on. Suitability for the vehicle, making sure that they've got a B license for driving a car or a van, something like that, you know. So foreign licenses, endorsements or convictions, penalty points. How many have they got and what are they for? If you should ask for that information. And that's, you know, you can understand then, well, if they're on 10 penalty points, one event could mean that they might lose their job. So it's important to work with them and try and keep them. It's much harder to keep a driver. It's much harder to recruit a driver than to keep them. So you should kind of work with them if you can. Medical conditions and eyesight and things like that, you know. And of course, we are saying check your licenses annually. And the driver should notify if there have been any changes. Driver induction is a big part. We've even got check sheets on that. So you're checking the licenses, your CPC details. CPC is a certificate of professional competence that haulage drivers and HGV people, drivers who drive mainly drive. These are things that they should have. So you should be asking, you know, what's their experience and their qualifications, and do a reference check. Ring them up. Who are you driving for? Driving history. Just because you were driving a car, now you're driving a van or a truck, your behaviour and your penalty points and your accident history will follow you. And it's important that you should, people should be reminded of that, you know, so that if they have an accident, their record, it'll be their personal record, and that should be noted to their own private policies as well. We talked about kind of, Deridre talked about the induction process and company policies and that. These are all very good. But what else is missing? Things like, you know, the age of the vehicles. Deridre mentioned about the grey fleet having higher, older vehicles and things like that. Looking at the mileage, who drives the vehicle, management. What does management have to do? Yes, allocation of the vehicles, and what is a high-risk driver? High-risk driver, we would say in Ireland, greater than 30,000 kilometres a year. Australia is probably more remote, things like that, but you get an idea. Anybody, and then if somebody is doing 60,000, well, you're still high, you know, but you should be doing, you should be more conscious. The more miles you're doing, the more exposure of a risk you are on the road. Accidents and incidents and penalty points, these are all important, you know. So, grand, you've got all the employees. What about the managing director? You know, what's their risk to the company? Should they should all be included in there as well. The driver handbook, I've made a reference there to the RSA driver's handbook. It's a fantastic document. It really is. There's a very good sections all the way in the event of breakdowns and things like that. On tire tread depth. And they would recommend 3 millimeters that you should be changing your tires. So you should look at what your policy says about changing your tires. What do you do in the event of an accident or breakdown? These are all things, you know, it helps somebody to start off, where would they begin? Things like that, you know, and they'll have an accident or they'll have a breakdown and they'll be thinking, oh my goodness, oh my goodness, oh my goodness, what will the boss say? Well, the boss will say, well, what happened? You know, so having a piece of paper, having a biro and having a blank accident report form in the car is a good place to start. So you'll be able to obtain details and things like that and complete the report form. And of course, report the incident to the manager is important. Accident incident recording. Who, what, where, when, how. Basically, you're trying to find out. This is for the manager afterwards. You're trying to establish, well, is there a trend here? Is there an age? Is there gender? Is there experience issues? Is there training issues? What happened? What vehicle was involved? Where did it happen? Where is it on the map? Was it at a junction? Was it on a main road? You know, when, time of day, weather conditions, nighttime driving, you know, you're trying to establish all these things. How did it happen? Was there driver distractions? You know, was there phone? Was there speed involved and things like that? And of course, try and find out then, is there a fault or not fault, or was it avoidable? Now, more than 90% of accidents are avoidable. So you can't be getting away from it. The driver is mainly going to be the person that's they're in control of the steering wheel and the accelerator and the brake. So it's a case of you have to find fault, but you must help them. Then, of course, managing the cost is also important. Charting and things like that. The Cadbury's came up with a graph called the Kit Kat graph. And they want to do is count how many Kit Kats did they have to produce to cover the cost of their vehicle collisions. Could have been not Cadbury's, but it could have been another chocolate manufacturer. But anyway, the end result was they had to produce 238 million Kit Kats. And it wasn't until they had that established that they managed to get drivers to understand how critical it was, and managers, of course. But that's great. You know, you've got all the accident analysis. You've established everything. You've established where all these accidents have taken place. The most important thing is share that experience with everybody within your company. Of course, you're going to have to remove the details of the person and try to hide from GDPR things like that, you know. But you have to be able to establish, you know, let's say if they're all having accidents around the Kinsale Road roundabout, or going over the bridge in New Ross or someplace like that, then you have to you try and establish, well, is there an issue that you have to be looking at? And you talk to the drivers, especially if you had HGVs and things like that, where you've got larger vehicles and smaller vehicles going together. The big one will always find it more difficult. And then, of course, I've kind of done a play on the word. Okay, so you've shared that experience with everyone, you know, and okay, did you check the driver's vision after the accident? Yes. Well, then why don't you check it beforehand? We all wanted to be proactive. So there's a good start. Vehicle safety, and making sure that you're choosing the right vehicle that is entirely suitable for the intended purposes. You cannot, the number of overloaded vehicles, and Deridre spoke earlier about guidance there on the HSA on safe loading, but vans and cars can be mightily overloaded as well and things like that. And of course, we need it to be inspected and maintained strictly in accordance with the manufacturer's guidelines and schedules. 14 pedestrians, 1 pedal cyclist. It reminds me again this year, year to date, these are vulnerable road users. Pedestrian cyclists, motorcyclists, 4 motorcyclists. And we're all talking about, so vehicle selection, things like that. You know, these are, when you've got a large truck, you're going to have a larger blind spot. There's things called Fresnel lenses, trying to bring in more so that you could see, you can get direct vision on the vulnerable person. And hopefully by seeing them directly, you won't drive over them, or that the cyclist will be able to see what you intend doing. This is a view from the window of an RSA truck, actually, above in the ploughing championships above in, there's Carlow, I think, before, and you can see that's from the view of the driver's seat. That when he looks out the mirror, there's not an awful lot that you can scan and quickly spot to see if you can spot a pedestrian or cyclist. So the way around that, and London from the 26th of October this year, they'll be bringing out the direct vision standards. Now this is for London, so that if you ever Google kind of direct vision standards, you'll be able to get to see things like this. So on the up here on the top left, you've got a truck, a low entry cab, with view panels, things like that, where the driver can see clearly, you know, the pedestrians and things like that. A traditional truck, the pedestrian, they're the same person, but they will not be able to be seen. They'll be standing outside of the view of the cameras and the mirrors and things like that. So that is why the direct vision standard is probably something, if you've going to go looking at vehicle selection, it will be a way to go. That will be, so the other things, you know, what is the way of the future? So the other ones are like, okay, you've got driverless trucks. That's hopefully still a long way away. Crash avoidance systems, you've got Mobileye, you see them on modern cars and things like that. They've got camera technology to be able to keep the car in the middle of a lane. So that's lane departure. And they've also got, and with that camera technology, you can mix it then with radar systems that will give you forward collision avoidance as well. There's a whole load there all about cameras, and you can have them everywhere along the side of the truck. You can even have side sensors to be able to detect pedestrian. The same way as a modern car would have reverse sensors. Trucks can also have these fitted. But do cameras prevent accidents? They don't. Why? They'll capture the incident and things like that. They'll tell you what happened before the incident, you know, and what did the driver do. The best fleets will debrief the driver when they arrive back to a depot. They'll praise them. You should be praising them when they praising them if they're doing it right, and you should be giving them guidance where they're not doing it well. So it's all about, it's a great opportunity. If there's harsh braking, harsh cornering and things like that, you can read the telematics and help the driver then with guidance and things like that. Deridre spoke about commercial vehicle CVRT, how the drivers have to inspect their trucks. There's a whole load of things there on a truck. It will take you a while, things like that, but the professional drivers will know what to do. But the grey fleet, what would the grey fleet do? And the company car, there's a whole load of checks then that have to be done there. You should start off with the lights, the tires, going around, look at the wheels, see your tread depth. Just on the virus thing, you've got China's producing an awful lot of tires. At the moment, there's a lack of supply in the market, especially in haulage tires, and you'd never know, maybe your car tire might also be difficult to get. So if you're managing a fleet, make sure you can get an adequate supply for your vehicles. Weather alerts, this was one that came out in 2016, and they're all modern ones now, all about weather warnings and things like that. Talk to your drivers. If it's red, you really shouldn't be driving. You should be deciding what else you should be doing. or you should be delaying the journey if possible. If anybody knows what this is a tachograph, a digital an analog tachograph. Ever since 2006, they all became digital. There's a whole load of guidance there about 4.5 hours max driving, 9 hours a day and 10 hours a day. The maximum you could do is 56 hours, and you could only do 30 something the following week. This is all changed because of COVID-19, and they have increased the working time hours now to 5.5 hours maximum driving in any one time. Now, believe me, that will definitely come up. You'll definitely get tired after that. So you need to start managing the drivers and the driver hours, and fatigue is important. Yes, tiredness kills. It's on the side of the road. You'll see it on the motorways. So just to try and work with it. Journey planning. You can't go there. You know, these are simple little decisions that will ruin your journey. Hey, you can't do that. You know, loose bulk loads, lorries and things like that, they can easily take a tunnel out of use, and you could be stuck under it, and of course your reputation will go with it. You'll be on Twitter before you even get the notification from the driver. Load securing, the HSA have fantastic guidance there on load securing. There's also, these are excellent guides that I would be sending out to clients. The HSA Managing Driving for Work, there is your responsibilities. European Transport Safety Council is fantastic. The Road Sense Guide, and finishing up nearly there. You have the powers, management superpowers, to influence drivers' behaviours. So let's see what you can do. And that is me. If you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Fabian and Deirdre. Fantastic presentations. We can go through some of the questions quickly, guys, if you don't mind. Deirdre and Fabian, yeah?
Yeah.
All right. I'd start with one. I think this one, well, both of you can answer, but I think it was directed at Deirdre's presentation. So from Colette, for personnel involved in work-related driving, apart from being licensed to drive the vehicle they operate, is there any requirement for additional training?
This is Deirdre speaking. I'll answer this one, Fabian. Just other than for trucks and buses at the moment, there isn't a legal prescriptive requirement for additional training such as the driver CPC. However, there is a requirement under occupational health and safety legislation for employers to provide instruction, information and training that's commensurate with the job that somebody's doing. So when we talk about training, it doesn't necessarily have to be formalized training. It can be on-the-job training, and in fact a number of businesses, quite a large number of businesses who are managing their driving for work, provide in-house function and job specific training specifically in relation to driving for work. And many examples are available actually on the drivingforwork.ie website, case studies on driving for work.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
I would probably add in that if you're giving anybody any vehicle, you should be giving an instruction. New car, old car, all cars feel different. So you should definitely provide some guidance, a walk around, making sure that the driver is fully aware of all the controls and how they work. Sensors, you know, what's this thing in the middle of the car, even dash cams, things like that. They all help.
Thanks very much, Fabian. Question number 2 then is, how do companies get visibility of penalty point status from Ray of company driver licenses? Questionnaires are obviously an option, but is there any others, or are there any others?
Currently in our, again, just to answer that quickly because I'm very conscious of time, currently in Ireland there isn't a central agency that can process that for employers. However, employers can build into their policies and procedures self-declarations on an annual or as needed basis by employees in certain circumstances.
Thanks, Deridre.
I would say the same. It's self-declaration. That's the only way we can
Declaration
go.
is the best approach. Thanks very much. Just one from Declan. Given the substantial risk associated with driving for work and the context you have put in regarding other risks, isn't there a very strong argument for advanced driver training becoming mandatory?
Again, can I answer that one just in the interest of time, because I have reviewed the questions. Advanced driver training at the moment, not up for discussion in terms of mandatory at the moment, because again, the training that's provided in each business is currently based on need. What is up for discussion at the moment, and it isn't advanced driving training in the sense of the meaning that we think advanced driving or defensive driving training like the IAM or ROSPA courses, but there is discussion currently in Europe to bring in a driver CPC for van drivers in particular. So there's nothing on the cards at the moment in terms of mandatory for car drivers advanced driver training really for any driver type, if you think about it. I'm not necessarily saying it wouldn't be a bad idea, but in the scheme of things, it's not currently under active discussion as far as I'm aware in Europe or otherwise.
From an insurance perspective, a company that did provide advanced driver training to their drivers would be seen as a positive, and it's a great opportunity for companies to write those things down as to how they manage their fleet. So any driver that had any advanced driver training, we would review it and see it as a positive.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, guys. Just another one from Anonymous. Builders often use vans or vehicles to pull a large trailer, but drivers don't have a license to pull a large trailer. Also, often number plates and trailers are different than that on the van. Can we just give a bit of feedback on that one, guys, please?
Well, again, just in the interest of keeping things as much as possible to time, and I do apologise, we're slightly short for time, and you can blame me. I'll put my hand up. I think what I direct people to is the very comprehensive and clear guidance on the RSA website, rsa.ie, in relation to towing equipment and requirements there.
Lovely. Just one from Linda. Hi, Deridre. If you have contractors working on your behalf and they're travelling to and from sites, are they included in Grey Fleet? And do you have to have the same procedures in place as you would have for direct employees?
I suppose it depends on the nature of the contracted employee. If they're on a fixed term contract with yourself directly, they should be treated in the same way as your direct employees, in terms of you can't really have a policy for one type of employee that you directly have control over and something different for others, and that's provided for under section 9 of the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act. But where they're not directly under your control, there is an obligation as well for cooperation and consultation and coordination between employers. So that includes sort of agencies that employ workers to ensure that requirements are laid down clearly and complied with, particularly around driving vehicles for work. You can't really have treat people differently in regard to occupational risk management.
Very good. And just a quick one in relation to license checks and similar for drivers. How does this fit in with GDPR, or do we know in relation to GDPR how that affects it?
There should, in terms of license checks and people declaring the self-declaration that I mentioned earlier, there should be no impediment to employers requesting for certain information and personal information. What needs to be clear is that the employer complies with the GDPR requirements in terms of the management and the storage of people's personal data, and that they very clearly outline why they're asking for the information, who's going to have access to it, and what the information will be used for and how it will be protected, that personal data. And that should, you can't use GDPR as an impediment to managing risk, but you obviously have to comply with the requirements of the data protection regulation in doing those due diligence exercises.
I would say exactly what Deridre is saying, that the employer has a contract with the employee, and a contract with the insurance company, and there's a whole load of small print as to how Aviva or other insurers, of course, would use and store their information. And it's all about establishing the risk. So the age, the history of driving, things like that. These are all information that is critical to rating a risk.
Thanks very much. We're running out of time, but we have time for 2 more quick questions, please, speakers. So, with many companies using transport controllers to direct operations, should these transport controllers not hold a transport management certificate of professional competence of some description?
I suppose, Paul, I'm not quite sure what the question is. I'm not sure if it means transport controllers in terms of transport operations control or just vehicle movements control. But if it is transport controllers, there are specific provisions laid down by the Department of Transport in relation to the operator CPC. They manage the operator CPC. I'm not necessarily as familiar with that as I am with other subjects, but I mean, that's really the reference point. What does the legislation say in terms of the duties and responsibilities of the operator, the transport operator under operator CPC legislation versus other roles in this supply chain? We can perhaps take that one offline and see if we can get a clear response to that.
I would just add to say that any training for management is always good. That's coming back from the CPC. So if you're carrying your own goods, you don't technically need it, but it is good. You will learn an awful lot about the industry by doing those CPC courses.
Lovely, thanks very much. And just getting to the last one now, really, that's all we have time for. We've a few more questions there. We'll try and respond to attendees, and thanks for all the questions and interactions, much appreciated. Just the last question is, if an employee does not disclose a medical condition similar to you as the employer, and is then involved in an accident, where do you stand on that from a safety and insurance perspective?
Fabian, do you want to take that?
The insurer would usually cover such an event. However, it all depends on the individual history, or it could be an event that came upon him just suddenly, things like that. If there's no prior history and you have not asked the question, then you have to, that's really, as they say, that's an ecumenical matter. I might go before a court or something like that.
Can I just quickly add there, I think for all the people who are tuned in, I think if you are managing people who drive for work, or you're advising people on the management of driving for work in any capacity and driving vehicles, that is subject to medical fitness to drive guidelines, which are due to be reissued. They're being revised at the moment, and they're due to be reissued in April. And I think, again, if you're talking about, I have my top 10 reference points. I think you should familiarize yourself with the medical fitness to drive guidelines for professional drivers, bus, truck, and taxi. But also the medical fitness to drive guidelines for others, B category license holders, and be very familiar with certain medical conditions that would preclude you from driving or impair your driving in any way, whether permanently or temporarily. And they need to be built into your policies and procedures to remind employees to declare if they have medical conditions to either HR or somebody in the business who can take that into account. And it may, unfortunately, preclude them from driving, depending on the nature of the condition. But not doing it and ignoring it is not an option. I think we all need to familiarize ourselves better in regard to that. So I direct you in that regard to the RSA website, rsa.ie.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Deirdre, and thanks, Fabian. Thanks to both our speakers. Thanks to all the attendees who dialed in on the webinar. It's great to see such a subscription. I'm going to pass it back. Just one other question regarding the slides to both speakers. I presume we'll be able to send these out to the attendees at some point, and
Yes.
answers to the questions specifically to different
I've
people.
no problems with it.
That's okay. Thanks very much, and thanks everybody again, and much appreciated. Cheers.